Under the radiant glow of the royal court, royal children were born in rooms gilded with gold, dressed in luxurious garments, and surrounded by devoted attendants and advisors. From the outside, it was an image of perfection, power, privilege, and absolute reverence. But behind those splendid walls, the truth was far darker and more tragic. Let us step into the story of three young monarchs, names once famed in history, but also symbols of corruption and the tragedy of power. Prince Cassius, the young King Calder, and Queen Isolde. Cassius was born into a mighty royal family, cherished like a treasure from a young age. Everyone around criticized and expected him to become a great king, a leader who would guide the nation through all challenges. But what Cassius lacked was true affection, not respect or fear, but the genuine love of parents and elders within the palace. From the age of 7, Cassius had to learn to sit on a mock throne, wear robes, and listen to stern lectures about politics and power. He was not allowed to play like other children, nor permitted to make mistakes or express emotions naturally. Every glance, every word was closely watched, and the smallest action could lead to punishment. Gradually, Cassius's soul was suffocated. Loneliness and fear seeped deeply into every corner of his heart. When he ascended the throne at 16, Cassius became a cold man, unable to trust anyone, frequently angry without reason. Power in his hands did not make him great, but corrupted him, turning him into a brutal king who ruled the people through fear and violence. Calder, the next king, had an even more tragic fate. As the only son of a declining dynasty, Calder was burdened with the responsibility to revive the nation while still a teenager. But Calder's parents, busy with power struggles and political schemes, never cared about his feelings or growth. Calder grew up in coldness and suspicion. He never knew who were friends or foes within the palace, and this created a warped mindset. Calder became paranoid, distrustful, and lived in constant fear of betrayal. Ironically, this insecurity led Calder to order the execution of many royal family members and nobles, even his closest relatives, over a suspicious look or a small rumor. Calder's story was filled with turmoil, from lavish feasts to bloody purges, creating a dark legend of a young king with a soul full of unhealed wounds. Meanwhile, Queen Isolde bore her own tragedy. Daughter of a prestigious dynasty, Isolde was carefully shielded but lacked sincere affection. Her parents were too busy forging alliances and consolidating power, leaving Isolde feeling abandoned and lonely from childhood. Forbidden to show emotions, Isolde became a cold and determined young woman. She learned to use her intelligence and beauty as weapons to manipulate those around her. Yet deep inside, Isolde was still a child in need of love and comfort. When she took the throne, Isolde became a strict, sometimes ruthless queen, ready to punish anyone who threatened her crown. But behind that power, she struggled with ghosts of the past and emotional wounds that could not heal. These three stories are not merely tales of the worst kings in history, but vivid evidence that power cannot protect children from harm. On the contrary, it plunges them into spirals of tragic suffering. Power placed an invisible burden on these young monarchs, forcing them to mature too quickly, lose their innocent childhood, and gradually become strangers to themselves. The absence of genuine love and psychological support made them prone to downfall, corruption, and devastating consequences for their entire realms. In the cold royal chamber, the flickering candlelight cast shadows on the young but darkened face of Prince Valerian. Since being crowned Crown Prince at the age of 8, he was no longer an ordinary child. The weight of power pressed heavily on his shoulders. Holding the scepter earlier than his age, Valerian was not allowed to make mistakes or show weakness. But instead of being taught how to be a benevolent leader, he only learned manipulation, imposition, and fear. Valerian grew up in an environment where power was the only measure of human value. Gradually, human emotions such as love and compassion for the weak were crushed under the weight of the throne. He became a tyrannical prince, ready to mercilessly punish anyone who dared to challenge or embarrass him. One winter night when Valerian was 16, a strange event occurred in the palace. While reviewing noble dossiers, he discovered a secret letter containing a decree of deposition from the opposition. Fearing betrayal, Valerian ordered his guards to arrest all involved, but panic made him act more brutally than expected, causing many innocent people to die unjustly. From then on, the young crown prince's bad reputation began to spread throughout the kingdom, a symbol of fear and cruelty rather than trust and hope. In a distant land, Princess Livia, a child born in luxury but deprived of the freedom to express herself, suffered a similar tragedy. Livia was not only a symbol of power, but also a person struggling with the corruption within herself. Since childhood, Livia was confined within strict boundaries, forbidden to reveal her true emotions. Every look and word was carefully controlled, causing her soul to gradually become hardened and closed off. When power was bestowed upon Livia at the age of 14, she could no longer recognize that she had lost the warm humanity within. She ruled by fear, cunning, and cold cruelty. Once, to consolidate her throne, Livia ordered the murder of a close person, the only one who had ever made her feel a bit of true love. This act not only shook the palace, but also deepened the cracks in her soul. It was rumored that after this event, Livia no longer saw sunlight, living only in darkness and persistent nightmares. Not far away, Prince Darius was also a testament to the disaster of early power. Ascending the throne before turning 15, Darius was completely isolated from the outside world. People saw only a silent, brooding prince, but those close to him knew well that inside was a chaotic, painful, and resentful soul. Darius used his power to exact revenge on those he believed had hurt him, the advisors, nobles, even family members. Every night, the palace echoed with cries, the sound of daggers, and secret executions. But in those dark hours, Darius increasingly drifted from humanity, becoming a bloodthirsty king, haunted by the ghosts of the past. Prince Alaric was born into a family admired and respected by the people. His father, King Theodoric, was a legendary hero who led the country out of bloody invasions, bringing peace and prosperity after decades of war. In everyone's eyes, Alaric was not only the heir to the throne, but also a flame of hope. This is the bright future of a glorious dynasty. From an early age, Alaric was surrounded by love and infinite expectations. The people watched every step, every gesture of the young man as if observing a living symbol, the symbol of strength, justice, and wisdom. Alaric's childhood was covered with a radiant halo. The most seasoned advisors in the court spent time teaching him ethics, strategy, and the art of ruling. Everyone believed he would be a king who could continue his father's glorious legacy, bringing sustainable development and prosperity to the country. However, behind those admiring eyes, no one noticed the darkness beginning to creep into Alaric's soul very early. Alaric's childhood was unlike that of ordinary children. Although surrounded by attentive care, the pressure of great expectations weighed so heavily on him that there was almost no room for freedom or mistakes. Every action was strictly monitored, every word scrutinized to be perfect so as not to overshadow the image of the future hero. The fear of failure was so great that Alaric gradually withdrew, learning to hide his true emotions beneath a mask of coldness and resolve. Inside the young man was deep loneliness and a soul tormented by the unrealistic expectations of adults. Simple moments of play were replaced by rigid lessons, secret meetings, and endless drills. Instead of being taught how to love and empathize, Alaric was trained to become a warrior and a stern ruler. One cold winter night, while the palace lay silent in darkness, a secret meeting took place in King Theodoric's private chamber. The elderly advisors discussed the increasingly chaotic political situation, the sinister plots lurking both outside and within the court. King Theodoric, with a stern face, looked at his son, who had been sitting quietly for a long time, and spoke in a harsh, grave voice. "Alaric, tomorrow you will face your first challenge, not with a sword, but with wisdom and the strength of will. The country has no room for the weak or the hesitant." Alaric's eyes lit up strangely, a mixture of determination and a fear never before revealed. That moment marked an important turning point in his life, when power was no longer something given gently, but became a shackle weighing down every breath. Just a few months later, King Theodoric suddenly died in an unexpected battle with the enemy, leaving the throne to Alaric, the young man who was only 18 years old. The people mourned, piling expectations onto the young successor's shoulders. At first, Alaric presented himself as a fair and wise king, quickly adjusting policies to stabilize the situation. But beneath that facade, a transformation gradually became clear. The relentless pressure, loneliness, and ghosts of the past drove Alaric to paranoia. Fear of betrayal and losing power made him increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, even the most loyal. Starting from small doubts, he began monitoring and interrogating officials, and one by one, real and false plots led him to order many executions. One stormy night, Alaric summoned the royal council in the Great Hall. As the flickering lights cast shadows, he announced the decision to purge a group of high-ranking officials accused of treason. Everyone was shocked to see the once young crown prince now transformed into a ruthless, unforgiving king. Stories began to spread about secret executions, long nights of interrogation, and even times when the prince personally passed judgment. A symbol of hope had now become an image of cruelty and fear. The only family member who tried to pull Alaric out of the darkness was his sister, Princess Serafina. She always reminded him of love, compassion, and justice their father had once taught them. But those words were like faint echoes amid the storm raging in Alaric's heart. Once, during a fierce argument, Serafina begged him not to let power blind him, not to become what their father never wanted him to be. Alaric only looked at her with empty, cold eyes and turned away, leaving Serafina with tears. Gradually, Alaric became closed off and distant from everyone. Royal ceremonies were no longer occasions to show harmonious power, but cold performances filled with suspicion. The people began to fear the young king, and secret rebellions appeared more and more frequently. The children who once looked at Alaric with admiration now see only a ghost of brutal power, a symbol of corruption and loss of humanity, exactly like the worst king's history has ever recorded. The palace that once shone brightly under King Theodoric has now become a labyrinth of darkness and chaos. Prince Alaric, the young man once expected to be a symbol of hope, has completely transformed into a mad and cruel king, a terrifying ghost of power that strikes fear into everyone. From the very first days on the throne, Alaric faced enormous pressure from enemies both inside and outside the court. But instead of patiently learning and strengthening stability, the young man quickly got caught in a whirlpool of suspicion and fear. Alaric's immature and inexperienced soul could not withstand that pressure, and the power in his hands became a poison, slowly eroding his true nature. No one could forget the fateful night when Alaric ordered the mass execution of officials simply because he suspected them of involvement in a treasonous plot, a conspiracy that was never clearly proven. The cries, the swinging daggers in the dark, and the smell of blood throughout the royal corridors made the witnesses tremble to their bones. The palace, which had once symbolized greatness and order, had now become an arena of cruelty and chaos. The power in Alaric's hands was no longer a tool for building, but turned into a weapon for punishment and control. He imposed a series of harsh laws, forbidding any meetings or discussions without permission. Even his most trusted people could not escape the gaze of suspicion, and many of them mysteriously disappeared during the night. One gloomy afternoon, when thick black clouds gathered densely in the sky, one of Alaric's most loyal advisors, old Minister Marcus, vanished without a trace. Rumors spread quickly throughout the court. Alaric had ordered his arrest, believing Marcus intended to betray him. But the truth, buried deep within the palace's most secret corners, remained unrevealed, creating a dramatic veil of mystery. Alaric's corruption was further shown through his unusual fits of rage and uncontrollable violent behavior. Officials recounted that on dark nights, the young emperor could erupt in fury for the smallest reasons, a strange noise, an unfriendly glance, or simply a fleeting feeling of unease. The palace shook with screams, banging on tables, and the terrifying cries of the unlucky. One of the most whispered stories was about Empress Elira, once the only light in Alaric's life. During a fierce argument, suspecting her of connections with the opposition, Alaric ordered her imprisonment and brutal beating right inside the palace. This event not only shocked the court, but also shook the people's faith in the young king. Alaric's crazy and brutal actions gradually created an atmosphere of terror throughout the kingdom. The people lived in constant fear. Small rebellions began to erupt in border regions, while lords and nobles quietly sought ways to overthrow the mad king. With each passing day, the bright hope that once shone in the people's eyes faded, replaced by the darkness of chaos and insecurity. The palace, once the heart of a mighty empire, now seemed like a cage holding horrific secrets and inevitable collapse. In ultimate loneliness and confusion, Alaric became a victim of the very power he once longed for. Power did not help him mature, but distorted his nature by pushing him into unforgivable, brutal acts, turning the palace into a swamp of suffering and fear. The corruption of Alaric was not only a personal tragedy, but also a harsh lesson on how power, given too early, can destroy a person, turning the light of hope into the darkness of madness and cruelty, leading to the downfall of an entire dynasty. Pope Felix, who was chosen as the supreme leader of the church at a very young age, was not selected because of holiness or deep faith, but because of the enormous political power of his family within the church and the Roman court. Appointing Felix as pope at that time was a strategic move by his family's influence to consolidate power, not a spiritual elevation of faith. From the very beginning of his tenure, Felix's lack of a virtuous foundation became clearly evident. Instead of becoming a spiritual guide for millions of believers, he gradually turned the papal office into a tool of secular power filled with schemes. The meetings of the Curia were no longer places to discuss faith and spirituality, but arenas for intrigues, power struggles, and personal ambitions. Felix quickly fell into a luxurious lifestyle, distancing himself from the simple and humble values that were the foundation of the traditional papacy. The papal palace became a venue for lavish parties where power and money dictated every decision. Those close to him were no longer virtuous advisors, but opportunists, constantly seeking to exploit Felix's position for their own ambitions. One of the most shocking events in the church's court was when Felix ordered the purge of bishops and monks who were not aligned with his family's faction. These individuals were accused of betrayal, heresy, or even being enemies of the church. Harsh punishments were arbitrarily imposed, creating an atmosphere of fear and confusion among religious officials. The relationship between Pope Felix and secular powers also became increasingly murky and dangerous. He did not hesitate to engage in political negotiations, exchanging power and personal interests with kings and lords to maintain his family's dominance. This made the papacy almost a pawn on the chessboard of worldly power, far from its sacred mission. Felix's insincerity and lack of faith in his governance caused the trust of many believers to gradually decline. Many clergy began to question his worthiness on the papal throne and the purity of the church. Internal disputes erupted more fiercely, threatening to fracture religious unity. Strangely, despite his great power and family support, Felix could not maintain his position for long. Political rivals inside and outside the church sought every way to remove him through conspiracies and sophisticated schemes. Rumors of poisonings, assassinations, and dark plots spread within the papal court, making the power environment suffocating and dangerous. One stormy night, a secret meeting of cardinals was held to decide Felix's fate. Whispered voices, suspicious glances, and betrayal within the heart of the church painted a chaotic and dramatic picture. The outcome of this meeting changed the power balance in the church, marking the rapid downfall of the young pope. Felix is a vivid symbol of the corruption of power when a religious office is used as a tool to serve personal and family interests instead of spiritual guidance. He is proof that power given to the wrong person, without virtue and faith, will distort the sacred nature and bring serious consequences to both the institution and the community. It was Felix's murky governance that stained the image of the church, shook believers' faith, and created long-lasting consequences for many generations afterward. His story is still recounted as a profound warning about the dangers of power corruption in religious and political history. Under the dense shadow of power, Pope Felix gradually transformed the church from a spiritual lighthouse into a fortress of corruption and abuse of authority. The early days, filled with hope for a young pope with a new vision, were quickly swallowed by personal ambition and dark desires that Felix could not control. Within the papal palace, lavish parties lasted all night, candles burning brightly, while outside the people grew increasingly disappointed and lost. The church, once regarded as the spiritual home of millions of believers, had become a gathering place for the extravagant and powerful who exploited faith to satisfy their own desires. Felix did not hesitate to use papal power as a tool to serve trivial pleasures. Important decisions were no longer based on morality or faith, but became bargaining chips exchanged among factions and individuals within the court. Trusted cardinals were rewarded with titles and lands in exchange for absolute loyalty, regardless of the deepening moral decay. One of the most shocking stories was about the decadent and licentious life inside the papal palace, where divine worship gave way to all-night parties filled with conspiracies and dark compromises. From public ceremonies to secret meetings, deceit and betrayal became unwritten rules. The faith of millions of believers gradually wavered as news of scandals and corruption was exposed. Bishops once respected were now accused of embezzlement, selling offices, and condoning wrongful acts. The church slowly lost its sanctity and became a symbol of severe decadence. Felix's corruption was not limited to the internal affairs of the church, but deeply affected the politics and society of the era. He continuously intervened in power disputes among kingdoms and lords, using the church as a tool to manipulate and control vast lands. Church decrees were no longer moral teachings, but political tactics serving personal and factional interests. One dark night, in a secret meeting room of the Curia Council, the darkest conspiracies were planned. Felix and his allies launched a campaign to purge opponents, using fear and repression to maintain power. Heresy trials became rampant, with many innocent people sentenced to imprisonment or execution under tragic and mysterious circumstances. The people's trust was mercilessly crushed. Prayers and sermons no longer brought comfort, but instead fear and despair. People began abandoning the church, turning to new sects or other beliefs, causing the church to gradually lose its sacred status. Even within the church, many clergy began to doubt and speak out against Felix's corruption. However, these voices were silenced by power and violence, making the atmosphere more suffocating and dark than ever before. The corruption and abuse of power by Pope Felix left a deep wound not only for the church but also for the society of the era. From a center of spiritual light, the church turned into an arena of brutal power and decadence, leading to a prolonged crisis of faith spanning generations. And in the darkness of those luxurious palaces, the name Felix is still incessantly mentioned as a tragic symbol of the corruption of power, a harsh warning about abusing a sacred position for mundane and petty purposes. Darius was born in a chaotic era when the court was shaken by endless struggles. From the very first days of his life, he witnessed bloody battles not only between external forces, but also within the royal family itself. Silent betrayals, bloody power schemes eroded Darius's trust and love from a very young age. Darius's father, the previous king, was ruthlessly assassinated by power-hungry conspirators. His mother, despite trying to protect him, was drawn into a whirlpool of suspicion and betrayal. Darius grew up knowing no peace, only schemes and looming death. Every day was a fight for survival, where only strength and coldness could keep one alive. Darius's childhood left no room for dreams or tenderness. He learned to look at everyone with suspicion, never fully trusting anyone. Closest friends could turn into enemies in an instant, and betrayal always lurked like an inescapable dark shadow. He gradually grew up in that environment with deep hatred for those who destroyed his family. But more than that, he learned that to survive, he had to become stronger than anyone else. Cruelty was not a choice but an instinct. He trained his body, mind, and intellect to become an unrelenting warrior. When Darius was crowned king in his 20s, everyone in the court was wary of his coldness and decisiveness. From the first days in power, Darius showed ruthless severity. Those suspected of disloyalty or bearing signs of betrayal were severely punished, whether high officials or low-ranking soldiers. Darius's rule was based on absolute control and fear. He turned the palace into a fortress where no one dared to speak the truth without risking death. Secret purges took place every night, making the court atmosphere always suffocating, full of suspicion and extreme tension. One stormy night, Darius summoned a secret meeting with his close advisors. In the dim light of oil lamps, he spoke with an icy tone, "Only strength guarantees survival. Betrayers will never be forgiven." Not long after, many secret executions happened. Those once closest to Darius suddenly became enemies, accused of conspiracy and sentenced to death. The people lived in constant fear, not daring to sigh or utter a word of dissent. Darius ruled not only with physical power, but also with subtle manipulation to control others' minds. He sowed distrust among officials, preventing them from uniting against his authority. Everyone had to protect themselves by serving and obeying the king absolutely. But it was precisely within that cruelty and suspicion that Darius was imprisoned in his own loneliness and obsession. He trusted no one, not even those closest to him, and this created an endless spiral of confusion and loss. The palace was no longer a place of warmth or trust, but a fortress of terror. Whispers about assassinations, covert power struggles, and cries of injustice in the darkness constantly haunted everyone. Darius became the worst king, not only because of his brutality, but also because the obsession with power turned him into a lonely and inhuman figure. Wounds from the past and the corruption of power created an irredeemable man, a king remembered by history as a symbol of fear and injustice. Darius is clear proof of the tragedy of power when it is given to a soul that is not whole and a heart full of pain. Growing up amid violence and betrayal turned him into a cold, ruthless individual who used fear and power to control everything around him, and ultimately those very things plunged him into the darkness of loneliness and despair. Under the cold moonlight, Darius's palace shone like an impregnable fortress, where every sound was monitored, every gaze watched. The young king, once a symbol of strength and decisiveness, had become a ruthless tyrant, ruling with an iron hand and overwhelming fear. Immediately after ascending the throne, Darius established an extremely sophisticated secret police system, known as the Divine Eyes, who infiltrated every corner of the palace and city, ready to report any signs of dissent or betrayal. No one could feel safe, not even his closest confidants. Sudden arrests, brutal interrogations, and secret death sentences became daily occurrences, creating a suffocating, intense atmosphere. Darius relied not only on physical violence to maintain power, but was also haunted by a paranoid belief that he was chosen by the gods to purge all enemies, real or imagined. Each passing day, suspicions grew, and the fear of betrayal turned into uncontrollable rage. One dense, dark night, after receiving an anonymous letter accusing a conspiracy against him, Darius immediately summoned his most trusted generals and officials. With eyes burning like fire, he declared that anyone involved would be severely punished, regardless of kin or friends. Fear engulfed the court, forcing everyone to bow in silence. But the ultimate tragedy marking Darius's absolute corruption was when he killed his only son. The son, once the hope to succeed him and a symbol of life in the future, was seen as a potential threat in the emperor's mind. The reason behind this horrific event remains a mystery debated for years. Some say the child unwittingly did a small act that made Darius think it was a sign of betrayal. Others speculate that Darius was driven by a madness of power so extreme that he lost all control, unable to distinguish friend from foe. Whether true or not, the horrifying scene of that day remains recorded in the memories of the survivors. The blood-curdling screams, the sound of daggers falling on the cold stone floor, and the cold, emotionless eyes of the king who had abandoned all affection to protect the throne at any cost. After the incident, the palace became more terrifyingly silent than ever before. Those who were once close to the prince mysteriously disappeared, and Darius became increasingly isolated on his throne. Absolute power seemed to have transformed him into a completely different person, alienated, cold, and no longer the child once full of dreams. During long, lonely nights, Darius struggled with the ghosts in his mind, fear and paranoia, but no one was allowed to see that weakness. All eyes were on him with extreme fear, not daring to utter a word or even sigh. Darius's cruelty and loss of control are costly evidence that power given too early and without maturity can turn a person into a corrupt, ruthless being who loses himself and even kills the most sacred things in his life, even his own son. Darius's story still echoes in history as a harsh warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the peril when fear dominates the soul of a king. Society gradually slipped into crisis as those in power could no longer maintain the virtue necessary to lead the people. Power, a double-edged sword, does not create cruelty, but only reveals clearly the true nature of those at the pinnacle of power, often selfishness, cruelty, and boundless ambition. Kings once expected to inspire and protect justice have now become symbols of corruption and decay. They use power not only to rule, but also to satisfy personal desires, turning the throne into a gathering place of dark conspiracies, and endless struggles. The people's disillusionment began with empty promises, unjust policies, and blatant corruption. Within the court, those once attached to their noble missions became mere puppets in the hands of power-hungry individuals. Schemes and betrayals unfolded openly, and trust vanished. Governing the country became a game of power rather than a sacred responsibility to the people. Distant lands descended into chaos where laws were ignored and violence prevailed. The suffering people lived amid turmoil, poverty, and injustice. Rebellions erupted more frequently but were crushed with brutality and inhumanity. Faith in the king and the court collapsed, replaced by confusion and despair. The collapse of morality affected not only politics, but deeply penetrated the spiritual and cultural life of society. The church, religious organizations, and sacred symbols once revered became tainted by scandals, corruption, and the corruption of power. Stories were told of religious leaders using their positions to protect personal ambitions, suppress honest voices, and plunder the people's wealth under the guise of divinity. This not only weakened trust, but also sowed suspicion and division within the community. In this dark picture, the worst kings like Alaric, Felix, and Darius emerged as vivid symbols of decay. They were not external destroyers of society, but those who brought it down from within through the corruption of power and boundless cruelty. The horrific truth is that power does not turn people into tyrants, but only helps them reveal the darkest, deepest parts of themselves. When leaders lose their virtue, society becomes like a house built on sand, unable to stand firm against the fierce waves of the times. This decline is not only an end, but also a milestone marking the beginning of darker eras, where humanity must pay with blood and tears. The lessons from this brutal history echo endlessly as a harsh warning about the strength and danger of power when it is without limits and control. Only when people know how to uphold virtue and humility can power truly become a force to build rather than to destroy. But when greed and cruelty take hold of a ruler's soul, the collapse of society is only a matter of time, and the tragedy of the worst kings will become a painful, unforgettable lesson in human history. The morning light seeps through the mossy windows of Roland's palace, but cannot ease the gloomy atmosphere that envelops everything. The young king, once expected to inherit the glory of his ancestors, now faces the greatest challenge of his life, confronting the anger and rebellion of the very people he ruled with absolute power. Roland, born into a dynasty full of glory, but also chaos, never proved real leadership ability. Weak decisiveness and excessive ambition for power quickly lost him the support of the people and court allies. At first, his supporters still hoped King Roland would reflect on himself, but day by day, wrong policies and brutal oppression worsened the situation. The lands far from the center began to fall into chaos and misery as taxes were pushed to sky-high levels to fund the court's lavish lifestyle. The people, already poor and despairing, could no longer bear the growing burden weighing down on their shoulders. Sighs of frustration gradually turned into shouts of protest, and the initial small demonstrations grew into a widespread uprising. In the port city of Rivermark, an important commercial hub, the rebellion broke out fiercest. Thousands poured into the streets, waving flags and shouting slogans against the oppression and injustice of King Roland. They were no longer silent sufferers, but had become a determined force ready to demand rights and change. Roland's palace grew cramped and stifling as court officials continuously reported bad news. Rebellions spread, local lords began showing dissatisfaction and started gathering their own forces. Roland felt his power gradually collapsing, but was still not clear-headed enough to find the right path. In a secret meeting with close advisors, Roland tried to assert his authority, ordering all rebellions to be crushed by violence. However, warnings about the consequences of using force were ignored. "Power is mine, and whoever dares oppose will pay dearly," he shouted defiantly. But reality did not go as Roland wished. The suppression in Rivermark became a disaster. His soldiers were not only fiercely attacked by the people, but also suffered heavy losses. News of the defeat spread like a storm, fueling the rebellious spirit in other regions. The loss weakened the army and severely damaged the king's reputation. Amid the fierce shaking of power, lords and close officials began to question Roland's leadership ability. Internal meetings became tense, Factions competed for influence and sought solutions to the crisis. Some wanted to overthrow Roland, others proposed he make concessions to keep the throne. In a moment of impasse, Roland was forced to convene a special council between the king, representatives of the people, and the lords. This was the first time in history that an absolute monarch had to directly dialogue with factions and citizens about the limits of his power. The conference took place in a tense and suspicious atmosphere. The people brought lists of demands for rights, justice, and transparency in governance. The lords also proposed many measures to ease pressure on the populace and reform the ruling system. Though pained, Roland realized he had no choice but to accept an agreement to keep the throne and avoid a full-scale civil war. After days of prolonged negotiation, the Rivermark Treaty was born, a document marking the first historical limitation of King Roland's power. According to it, the king no longer held absolute authority, but had to share power with a council of lords and representatives of the people. Important decisions required consensus, and the people's rights were clearly recorded in legal documents. This was not only a political compromise, but a historic turning point, signaling the weakening of autocracy and paving the way for new models of governance in the future. The treaty sparked strong reactions in society. Many saw it as a victory for the people and a sign of positive change. However, some exploited the situation to provoke internal power struggles, leaving the court still submerged in undercurrents of instability. Though stripped of much power, Roland strove to maintain unity and stability in the court. Yet wounds of betrayal and helplessness made him brooding and distant, no longer the vigorous king he once was. Darius stood in the cold, great hall of the palace, dim lights reflecting off stone walls cloaked in shadows. The throne beneath him was like an invisible trap, both a symbol of absolute power and a prison with no escape. The power he possessed brought no happiness or peace, but buried him in an unshareable loneliness. Those around him kept cautious distance. No one dared to get close, fearing they might become the next victim of suspicion and merciless punishment. This loneliness was not only Darius's burden, but also haunted King Leon, who, while standing at the pinnacle of power, had fallen into the abyss of despair. Leon, once revered for his talent and justice, was now betrayed by the very throne he occupied. Those who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him had vanished or turned into enemies lurking in the shadows, leaving Leon tormented by nightmares of betrayal and loss. Darius's story vividly exemplifies the cruelty of power when devoid of sharing and kinship. Since ascending the throne, he built a regime ruled by fear, with a secret police network scattered everywhere to monitor and suppress all signs of dissent. Even his closest confidants dared not speak openly, for a mistimed word could mean death or loss of power. Living in a spiral of paranoia, Darius constantly believed everyone around was plotting against him. This obsession drove him to issue relentless purges, shattering families and allies alike. Every night, the sighs of the wronged echoed through the palace halls, making the atmosphere heavier and colder than ever before. Leon, meanwhile, faced loneliness in a different but equally tragic way. He was once a beloved king, respected by his people and allies, but power struggles and jealousy gradually fractured his close relationships. Leon was betrayed by his closest friend, the one he had trusted more than himself. This betrayal was not only a mental shock, but also left a deep wound in Leon's heart, causing him to gradually lose direction and become indifferent to the kingdom's critical issues. Mistakes began to appear, from mishandling internal crises to poor strategic decisions, leading to disastrous and irreparable consequences. Both Darius and Leon were supreme rulers, but were suffocated by loneliness and the loss of kinship. Power did not protect them from feelings of abandonment. Instead, it deepened their pain. They became ghosts within their own palaces, bound by suspicion and a lack of trust. Their mistakes were not merely personal faults, but inevitable results of loneliness in power. Darius killed his own son in a delusional rage, while Leon lost vital territories due to negligence and indecision. These tragedies not only toppled their dynasties, but also etched their names in history as some of the worst kings, symbols of corruption and collapse within power. One cold, rainy afternoon, as both kings sat alone in their private council chambers, no one knew they were enduring the utmost moments of loneliness. Darius, with a wild look in his eyes, muttered unheard prayers. Leon, with trembling hands, gazed out the window, thinking of those who betrayed him and all that was lost. No one came to comfort or share with them. Only cold silence and darkness surrounded. The pinnacle of power turned out to be the abyss of profound loneliness, where mistakes were born and tragedies began. As the court became a curtain hiding conspiracies and compromises, two monarchs, Emperor Severus and Queen Isolde, wrote the most tragic chapters in the history of power, where superstition and conservatism became the flames that burned the land and the souls of its people. Emperor Severus, born into a noble family but carrying a mysterious soul, was early captivated by ancient arts, alchemy, and astrology. From his time as crown prince, Severus spent most of his time in smoke-filled laboratories and among ancient manuscripts, searching for the formula to turn metal into gold and reading the stars to predict the future. This obsession gradually drew him away from the throne, leaving the country to sink into crisis and chaos. When Severus ascended the throne, he carried a strong belief that only mystical power could save the declining empire. Practical advisors and officials warned him of external dangers and growing public discontent, but Severus only smiled quietly, continuing to immerse himself in star predictions and chemical experiments. The economy weakened, the army lost discipline, and local lords began acting on their own. But instead of intervening directly, Severus devoted himself to alchemical manuscripts, believing that if he could find the philosopher's stone or divine secrets, the empire would miraculously revive. Many times, he issued meaningless decrees, such as restricting the production of ordinary metals to focus on gathering alchemical materials, causing severe disruption to trade and production. In the shadows of Severus's palace, whispers could be heard about mystical rituals held at night, with enchanting yet terrifying ceremonies. Wizards and prophets became the most influential figures, overshadowing court officials. Superstition not only weakened the government, but also sowed fear and confusion among the people. Ordinary citizens were equated with demonic forces if they dared to question or resist, while witch hunts and heresy persecutions took place everywhere, plunging society into greater chaos and dread. In another corner of the empire, Queen Isolde ruled with an iron fist and extreme conservatism. Born into a family with a tradition of strictly preserving ancient values and customs, Isolde believed the country's survival could only be ensured by absolutely maintaining these traditions. She used violence and repression to impose her will on every social class. Isolde showed no mercy to anyone daring to change, even minor reforms. She established special police forces to monitor and suppress any signs of rebellion or destruction of tradition. Executions and tortures were publicly carried out as warnings, instilling deep fear. Under Isolde's rule, youth and intellectuals were tightly controlled, forbidden from expressing opinions or experimenting with new ideas. Scholars and writers were forced to adhere to conservative views, or else be prosecuted as traitors or witches. Education became outdated, and society increasingly stagnated, losing creativity and progress. The flames of discontent gradually rose among the people, but all protests and uprisings were ruthlessly crushed. Villages were burned, and those who dared to stand up paid with blood and tears. Under that dark sky, the country sank into sorrow and ruin. The combination of Severus's fanatical superstition and Isolde's brutal conservatism created a deep, incurable wound for the empire. Power in their hands did not become a force for construction, but turned into a tool of destruction and control, causing society to lose balance and development. In rare moments, when night fell and the palace grew quiet, Severus and Isolde glimpsed the light of a different future. A future where the empire would not be strangled by superstition and conservatism, but fear and obsession with power prevented them from stepping out of the darkness, sinking instead into the tragedies they themselves created. Superstition and conservatism in power are not just the stories of Severus and Isolde, but a profound warning for anyone holding power. When people lose wisdom and tolerance, when power is ruled by blind beliefs and rigidity, tragedy inevitably comes to individuals, dynasties, and entire societies. Behind the dazzling veil of civilizing and enlightenment, King Leopold emerged like a dark ghost, hiding the true face of a brutal killer beneath the cloak of colonial authority. No one could imagine that behind the grand rhetoric of a noble mission and civilized progress lay horrific crimes that caused millions to bleed and suffer unspeakable agony. From the very first days of his rule, Leopold built a ruthless system of exploitation under the guise of civilization. With absolute power in his hands, he implemented profit-driven policies at any cost, regardless the lives and dignity of the native people. Troops were trained to use brutal violence to suppress all resistance, while officials and representatives of the regime sought to maximize the extraction of natural resources and the labor of the populace. Millions endured torture, poverty, and unspeakable loss. Many villages were burned, many families torn apart and destroyed. Cries for help and laments echoed throughout the dense forests, but only the native people heard them. Meanwhile, Leopold calmly wore the mask of an enlightened leader, organizing grand ceremonies to glorify himself before the world. Reports of horrific crimes began to leak out through handwritten letters from conscientious individuals within the empire. But the initial international response was only weak condemnations, powerless to change the horrific reality. Leopold exploited the world's silence and indifference to continue his brutal actions. One of Leopold's cruelest methods was forcing people to harvest rubber under extremely strict quotas. Those who failed to meet targets faced horrifying punishments, from having their hands cut off, being brutally beaten, to being savagely killed. The lush green forests became vast prisons where people were crushed by violence and despair. In that darkness, chilling stories of orphaned children enslaved, broken families, and widespread amputated limbs became the indelible tragic symbols of Leopold's reign. Yet despite the evidence, those responsible remained comfortably in power, continuing the dark veil of silence and deceit. However, not everyone resigned to fate. The native people, though brutally oppressed, always secretly fought to protect their lives and dignity. They became silent heroes, fighting by all means in the deep forests, plotting and resisting the oppression of the rulers. Alongside them, international journalists and human rights activists began exposing Leopold's crimes. Articles, letters, and campaigns spread across Europe and the world, applying strong pressure on the regime and forcing it to answer before public opinion. But the bitter truth remained. The wounds unhealed and the lives lost remain indelible marks. The powerful ruler left behind a legacy of blood and tears, one of the darkest chapters in colonial history that humanity cannot forget. Leopold, the assassin hiding behind the mask of civilization, is a horrific example of how unchecked and uncontrolled power can turn a person into a ruthless machine of destruction. His story is a profound warning about the dangers of absolute power and the international community's indifference to humanitarian disasters. The heroic and tumultuous history of humanity amidst countless shadows of brutal dynasties still holds kings shining with radiant humanity, those who used power not to oppress, but to uplift, to build a fairer and more humane world. Alexander the Great, King Solomon, and Marcus Aurelius stand as vivid symbols of wisdom, compassion, and justice, timeless lessons that later leaders continue to learn from. Alexander the Great, with his ambition to conquer the world, went beyond merely expanding territory. He carried a deep belief in cultural harmony. Unlike many kings before and after him, Alexander promoted cultural exchange between the Greeks and the conquered peoples. He respected local customs, encouraged diversity and harmony, and established new cities as centers of culture and education. His victories were not just about expanding borders, but also a mission to inspire understanding and cooperation among civilizations. King Solomon, known for his supreme wisdom and unwavering justice, left an ethical and administrative legacy admired by all humanity. The legend of his wisdom in resolving disputes, especially the story of two mothers fighting over a child, remains a symbol of justice and clarity. Solomon cared not only for material wealth, but also laid the foundation for the kingdom's spiritual prosperity. Under his reign, legal codes were strengthened, and the judicial system developed fairly and efficiently. King Solomon promoted scholarly culture, arts, and architecture with magnificent works like Solomon's Temple, symbols of holiness and national unity. His spirit of tolerance and justice contributed to the kingdom's prosperity and stability for centuries. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the Roman throne, embodied the union of wisdom and virtue. He was not only a brave warrior, but also a profound philosopher who spent much time reflecting on human nature, ethics, and responsibility. His work, Meditations, remains one of humanity's most important ethical guides. Marcus Aurelius ruled Rome during difficult times of continuous wars and devastating plagues, yet he maintained firmness and fairness in every decision. He valued humility, listened attentively, and always put the people's interests first. Under his leadership, Rome not only overcame harsh challenges, but also preserved admirable social stability and harmony. These three kings, though living in different eras and facing unique challenges, shared a common trait. They used power to serve the people's benefit, placing justice and ethics above all. They were not blinded by power. On the contrary, power became a tool for building a just, prosperous, and sustainable society. Their legacy lies not only in material achievements or military victories, but also in invaluable lessons on responsible and humane leadership. Alexander, Solomon, and Marcus proved that power, when used rightly, can become a force to change the world for the better. Looking at the worst kings in history, we see how power often reveals corruption, cruelty, and profound loneliness. But looking toward leaders like Alexander, Solomon, and Marcus, we find hope and light, that power, combined with wisdom and compassion, is not merely a weapon of destruction, but also a guiding lamp for humanity's future. This very difference creates a deep historical imprint and unforgettable lessons for future generations on the nature and responsibility of power.